Good evening, everyone. My name is William Ruger, and I am the Vice President of Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute. And on behalf of the Institute, I'd like to welcome you here to an exciting panel on American foreign policy. I'm particularly excited to be here to talk about this subject. This is a subject dear to my heart as an international relations scholar. And I'm also excited to be here because this is my home state. This is where I was born and raised, and excited to be in the Granite State, and I'm really excited to see such a great turnout. I'm just thrilled that we could fill up a room, and this is our second event in a row where we had a full room, and it really shows you how engaged Granite Staters are in the important issues in our national conversation. So kind of a round of applause for you guys.
Go Granite State.
Now, everyone has heard of Charles Koch, especially given all of the nice publicity around good profit. I'll focus on the positive. But you may not know as much about his namesake institution, the Charles Koch Institute. So let me tell you a little bit about it. The Charles Koch Institute, which is located in Arlington, Virginia, is an educational foundation, educational institute that focuses on the role freedom plays in individual and societal well-being. We are non-political and non-partisan, so we don't engage in politics. That's important. But what we are interested in are issues that relate directly to human flourishing and the role that free societies play in that. And so this subject is one that is of critical importance to a flourishing society because war is so potentially destructive. It doesn't mean that you would never engage in warfare, but we're going to think about and talk about what it means to have an America that is safe from foreign aggression, but without having the type of policies that actually imperil that which the foreign policy establishment is trying to secure. So we're going to have a conversation about that up here. And then we'll have Q&A afterwards, and I really invite your participation because it's important for us to hear those questions that people are talking about because we want to elevate foreign policy as part of the national conversation. In Washington, the conversation is really between the 48-yard lines when it comes to foreign policy. What we want to do is broaden that perspective and talk about some different ideas than you're used to hearing, perhaps, in Washington or in the mainstream media. So welcome and thank you. And now I'm going to introduce our panel. It's a distinguished panel. First, we have Andrew Bacevich. He's an American historian specializing in international relations, American foreign policy, and American diplomatic and military history. He's a professor emeritus of international relations and history at Boston University. He has held fellowships at the NITSA School of Advanced International Studies, the JFK School of Government, and the Council on Foreign Relations, and he holds a PhD in American diplomatic history from Princeton University. He is also a warrior scholar. He is a retired officer in the armor branch of the U.S. Army, retiring with the rank of colonel. So thank you very much, Andy, for coming. Seated to his right is Chris Preble. Chris is the Vice President for Defense and Foreign Policy at the Cato Institute. He was a commissioned officer as well in the U.S. Navy, serving aboard the USS Ticonderoga. Before joining Cato, he was a history professor at St. Cloud State University and at Temple University, which is where he earned his PhD in history. And then to his right is Stephen Kinzer, an award-winning foreign correspondent who spent 20 years working for the New York Times. He was the Times bureau chief in Nicaragua during the 1980s and in Germany during the 1990s. In 1996, he was named chief of the newly opened Times Bureau in Istanbul. So really a kind of man of the world for this panel, for sure. Now, since leaving the Times, Kinzer has taught journalism, political science, and international relations at various universities and is currently at Brown University. And he writes a regular feature in the Boston Globe, so he's a local. And then last but not least, for sure, is John Stossel. A few people might have heard of him. Like I said last night, he's someone I remember from 2020, a great news magazine on television, and did great work, investigative journalism and so forth. Now he works at Fox Business and is the author of so many different books, and is just a kind of wonderful moderator, as we saw last night, a real pro. So I appreciate you coming out, John. So thank you very much.
Okay, let's start. I admit to being remarkably ignorant on this subject and hope to learn, but I lived for the past 6 years in the world of Fox, where the majority opinion is that Obama is a wimp, and if he were not a wimp, there would be no terrorism, and we need to kill them over there before they kill us over here, and we're not doing enough to do that. So, and I'm told, compared to your opinion, that is more of a majority opinion in the community. So let's hear your take. How are we doing?
I'll start.
You start.
I think to respond to the lead-in, I think the beginning of wisdom is to reject the notion that Republicans and Democrats differ radically on these matters, that if you don't feel safe today, it's all Obama's fault, or that it's all George W. Bush's fault. The beginning of wisdom is to appreciate the power and the durability of an identifiable foreign policy consensus. All the people running for the presidency won't acknowledge the existence of this consensus, but it's important for us as citizens to acknowledge it. And I think the essence of that consensus stems from the assumption that the United States of America is called upon to transform the world in our own image. That what we are, who we are, what we represent, that all the world is somehow destined to conform to that model. And the second item on the consensus is that we can fulfill that providential mission through the exercise of the possession of supreme military power and the use of that military power. So you begin by recognizing that consensus, and from there you can begin to have a conversation about what's gone wrong.
That's right. It's going to be hard to follow after Andy. We're going to make sure we switch up the order of this sometimes. That's right. So I come from Washington. That's where I work. And there is an interventionist consensus on both the left and the right. Part of this is sort of understandable. People go to Washington because they think they can fix things, and so they're fixing the whole world. In my world, it's about foreign policy, and it's about fixing the whole world. It's about the idea that the United States' possession of vast power, military power as well as economic power, allows us, and in fact, in some respects, calls on us to fix the world or stop the world from going up in smoke. It's about kind of managing the world and shaping history in a way that moves it in the right direction. Now, again, from my perspective, that's rather hubristic, rather grandiose. On the other hand, the United States has done this in the past, and so people point to experiences after World War II and the creation of this wonderful liberal order and all the institutions that grew up after World War II. And for me as a historian as well, it's understanding both what motivated and what actually made that a reality in the immediate aftermath of World War II, but also how much has changed in the world over the last 70 years, which allows us to think more seriously about alternatives over the next, maybe not 70 years, but in the future.
Let me just add a different perspective there. I spend as little time in Washington as possible. But every time I go there, I am impressed, again, with how narrow is the spectrum of acceptable opinions on foreign policy. Anybody that challenges the consensus that you just heard about is dismissed as some kind of, I love that phrase from John McCain, a wacko bird. I want to make it like a t-shirt. I want to be that kind of a wacko bird. Somebody that doesn't share that consensus. But the Washington magnetism, pulling people into that consensus is very powerful. And I can tell you, as a person who has lived and traveled in many parts of the world, that no other country looks at the world the way we do. So even in large, important countries like Brazil or Germany or Russia, people see the world differently from the United States. The United States is more different. It's the most different country in the world. We're different from everyone else. The United States doesn't see the world the way others do. Other countries see the world made up of themselves and lots of other countries. People think, I'm in one country, there's another country over here, there's another country over there. Americans don't look at the world this way. We think that the United States is the sun, and all the other countries are little planets that rotate around it. That we are the center of the universe. And this is so deeply ingrained in our national psyche that I think
in fairness, we have some evidence. We've created the most prosperous society out of nothing. We have saved the world a couple times, sort of.
the arc of American history is very short, and it's quite misleading. The arc of American history tells us that we're always going to get richer and more prosperous and more powerful. That has never happened to any country in the history of the world. Countries that have survived over many, many centuries, like China or Iran, have done it by riding the currents of history. They realize countries get stronger, then they get weaker, then they get stronger again. Americans have had no experience with this. We are going to face a challenge in this coming century that I think transcends politics and military security. It's really a psychological problem. Americans are going to have to adjust to a world that we don't dominate the way we did in the last century. And nothing in our history prepares us to make this psychological change. If we can't make it, we are going to lash out in ways that are very destabilizing for the world. The United States has all the tools we need for continued success in the 21st century. But we have to adjust to the fact that we can't run the world the way we did for a brief period at the end of the 20th century.
Could I just respond? I know you haven't had a chance yet. Respond to John's intervention, which it seems to me is very much on point. What John was reflecting was, I think, a very sort of commonplace understanding of history shared by many Americans, that we saved the world. And our conviction that we saved the world, something that most of us grow up believing, then helps to undergird this notion that we can continue to save the world in the future. Where does that notion come from? More than in any other episode, it comes from World War II, that we saved the world at the time of maximum danger. Well, where'd the danger come from? Well, the greatest danger came from Nazi Germany, and indeed it did. My fellow Americans, I'm very sorry, we didn't defeat Nazi Germany. The far greater burden of sacrifice was borne by the Soviet Union, governed by a totalitarian dictator who was just about as evil as the totalitarian dictator who presided over Berlin. Now, I would be the last person to criticize Franklin Roosevelt for throwing in with Joseph Stalin in order to defeat Nazi Germany. But let's face it, when we acknowledge that fact, that complicates the story in very important ways and calls us to understand that this notion of we save the world is just too simplistic, and by extension, not useful for us today in understanding what U.S. foreign policy ought to be. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's a good point. I mean, I just wanted to jump in and talk a little bit more about what the status quo is. We're kind of rushing in and talking about where it came from, what are the motivations. But let's think about what the status quo is. I mean, we're a country that is formally committed to securing 68 other countries in the world.
That means we have a treaty that says if you're attacked, we'll defend you?
Yes, and that represents, I think, approximately 2 billion people. That's a great burden for a country of about 330 million alone, many of whom aren't that excited about actually having to defend these folks. It's also a case in which we are spending roughly what the next 7 or 8 countries combined spend on our defense spending. And that leaves out even some of the things that are related to defense spending, like veterans' costs and services for the people who come home from these wars. If you were a person born in 1991, some of you in the audience probably were born around that time, there's only been 3 years in your life when the United States has not been in a major conflict of one sort or another. So that's what the status quo is. The status quo is it's expensive, it's a lot of commitments, and it's a lot of sacrifice by people. And it means a kind of a perpetual war for perpetual peace, as the old saying goes.
And Americans seem to be going along with it. The political candidates all say, I'm going to be strong, and that's going to keep us safe. It seems to work.
It does for a couple reasons, John. One of the reasons is because it is rarely tested for the reasons that we've already talked about. Because there is this bipartisan consensus around the current grand strategy, the candidates really don't argue about the fundamentals. They're arguing around the margins, the implementation of this strategy. One of the core elements of the strategy where there is a big disconnect between the candidates and the political class and the public at large is on this question of being the world's policeman, defending other countries so that they are not inclined to defend themselves. Okay? This is an explicit purpose of the use of U.S. power. It is to reassure people. Now, again, I think we have to put ourselves in the position of those who were around when this was all created after the end of World War II. You could make a pretty important case that the common defense of these United States included the defense of Western Europe and some of the crucial states in East Asia as our allies against our enemy, former ally Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. The issue is we continue to do this. We continue to defend other countries, and as my colleagues like to say, I've stolen this line so many times, I might as well call it myself. We agree to defend them, and they agree to let us. And I don't blame them, right? If I were in their situation, I'd do exactly the same thing. Who among us says to someone when they go to pick up the lunch tab, no, I think we should split this. If the other guy says, I'll pick it up, I say, all right, great, go for it.
But Chris, I mean, is this status quo actually making us safer? I mean, part of your question was, hey, it's working, but I'd really challenge that. I'd ask the 58,000 Americans that died in Vietnam, 7,000 Americans that died in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that doesn't even count contractors. I'd ask the hundreds of Marines that died in Lebanon in 1980, in the early 1980s. I mean, they're not any safer, and the question is it making us safer? So for example, in Libya, when the United States mucks around in Libya, we have a condition in which the thing is that Benghazi is certainly one of those issues that pops up in our popular culture a lot. There's a new movie about it. But the real tragedy of this is that it's hurt our anti-proliferation efforts. It's hurt our counterterrorism efforts. It destabilized the region, so we've actually made it worse off in a place that we were ostensibly trying to help people in. Right. So this is something that just hasn't worked to make other people safer and has the threat of making us less safe in a massive way. And that's the same with our other commitments around the globe.
One of the things I find most lamentable about American foreign policy is how slow it is to change. We're not agile. We don't change our foreign policy as the world changes. We wanted to be an ally of Saudi Arabia for two important reasons. We needed their oil, and we needed them on our side to face the Soviet Union. We don't need their oil anymore, and there's no Soviet Union, but we haven't changed our relationship to Saudi Arabia. So we have great policies to deal with a world that doesn't exist anymore. And this is not a recipe for long-term success as a nation.
Let's turn to the immediate threat of ISIS, which is certainly in the news. The argument I hear at work is, again, kill them over there before they kill them here. Lindsey Graham says, the things we enjoy most in life, having dinner with friends, going to a concert, they hate the most. And I'm sure there are some crazy jihadists who hate these things, but my understanding is the terrorists have, for the most part, said, I want to kill you because you're in my country.
If there were a finite number of terrorists in the world, I think it would be a great strategy to go out and try to kill them one by one. But the fact is, each one you kill has cousins and brothers and sympathizers too. We're starting to realize slowly that when you shoot across someone's border, they might shoot back. And this is something that I think Americans are slow to grasp. We feel like we can dominate the blowback, the results of anything we do. And rather than try to consider in advance
what the blowback might be, what the negative consequences might be. We charge ahead with a singularly American view that we'll be able to take care of whatever situation emerges. I still remember back in the run-up to the Iraq War when the State Department ran this so-called Future of Iraq project and produced thousands and thousands of pages of what are we going to do in the weeks right after the invasion? What are we going to do with the electricity system? Who's going to run the water system? What's going to happen with the police? The Pentagon refused to consider any of that research because they said it was defeatist. It was suggesting by implication that there were going to be problems after the invasion. And that fact alone led them to refuse to plan for what came afterward, having nothing but blind faith in the abstract capacity of America to manage all situations. I think that's a form of hubris that is also dangerous and threatening for us.
So you would have us do nothing in these countries?
I'd like to take us a lot closer to that than where we are now. I'd like us to realize that there are situations in the world that we can't resolve, and that not every situation calls for our intervention. Just because bad people are doing bad things doesn't mean the United States has to get involved. Our measure for when we should intervene is mistaken. We intervene not when situations are moderate, but when they get bad, we think that means it's more important for us to intervene. That's the wrong measure. The right measure should be, is there a prospect that we can actually improve the situation? Right. We don't ask that.
Right. So, I mean, ISIS is clearly an outgrowth of the Iraq War. Stephen's already said this. We have to start the conversation right there. This is a direct result of upsetting the political order in Iraq that had existed for decades, okay? And it is true that a number of people, a few in Washington and some inside of government, pointed out this was likely to occur, the inability of the new Iraqi government to create a political system that would represent all of the people of Iraq. ISIS is the outgrowth of that. Now, I think it is certainly possible to exaggerate the amount of threat that ISIS poses to us. But it is not, I think, possible to exaggerate the threat that ISIS poses to the Iraqi government, to the Syrian government, to Turkey, to countries in the region. This is the point. ISIS has many enemies, and we should make sure that those enemies are focused on it. We haven't done a very good job of that so far.
I think I'd want to widen the aperture just a little bit, conceding that the entity that we call ISIS came into existence as a consequence of the U.S. Invasion of Iraq in 2003. I think it's important to see ISIS as a symptom of a much broader and more complex problem. And I don't know that I know enough about the history of the Middle East and of Islam more broadly to be able to pinpoint the real problem, but it does seem to me that we should recognize that the dysfunction that exists in that part of the world is very deep-seated, has very deep historical roots, and therefore, quite frankly, lies beyond the ability of the United States to fix. I agree that ISIS is a far greater threat to local parties than to us, which of course is the reason why we should press local parties to recognize that and act on it. I think ISIS is a very minor threat to us. But the big strategic question is, are there things that the United States can do, even if only on the margins, to try to alleviate, reduce that dysfunction which produces organizations like ISIS in the first place? That's
Are there?
I think there are, but point number one would be the U.S. Marine Corps ain't going to do it. That is to say that U.S. military power does not constitute a response to that sort of dysfunction. So what could we do? I think what we can do actually does only exist on the margins. But in a, it sounds like a cliche, but being the best society we can be is the beginning. to demonstrate that there is not necessarily any essential conflict between faith and modernity. That you can live in the modern world and you can be a believer, and there's not a contradiction between the two, as seems to be the perception in some quarters of the Islamic world. So what we can do is to live up to the ideals that we profess to believe in, and to share those ideals. For example, it sounds like a soft power academic thing. I understand that. Through cultural exchanges, through educational exchanges, to try to push back against the perception in some quarters of the Islamic
How
world that we are
wimpy,
in
my
faith.
colleagues would say.
They
They're
would.
beheading people over there.
They would say that. They would say
But you know, people say, oh, you guys are isolationists. And I think what Andy has shown you is that that couldn't be further from the truth. Even if you don't want the Marine Corps to be everywhere, or the US Army to be everywhere, it doesn't mean that you have to disengage from the world. You want to be an exemplar to the world, but promote cultural exchanges. But it's also that you could have a robust diplomacy, and don't forget about the importance of international trade.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm not a naive 19th century liberal in thinking that trade is going to solve every problem, but it certainly can help, like Andy said, on the margins. And I think that that's going to be a great way in which we can overcome this propensity to think military first for every problem. It's the proverbial, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
I like to look at this also in a deeper historical perspective. Cultures and civilizations go through traumas. Anybody that knows history knows this. Christianity kept Europe in the Dark Ages for 1,000 years. The Enlightenment finally happened. People decided we didn't want to live that way. The Islamic world is going through some of this trauma now. It's not something that can be stopped by coercive force. Look at the retreat of secular forces in other parts of that region. The Congress Party in India has faded. Ba'athist and Arab nationalism has faded. Secular Zionism has faded. Kemalism is fading. This is part of a return to civilizational roots that people have to go through. And I'll tell you something, I've spent a fair amount of time in Iran, and I was there just a few months ago. Iran is the most secular society I've ever been in. There's no polls to show this, and anybody who tried to take one would probably be arrested, but there might be a larger percentage of atheists in Iran than in any other Muslim country. Why did that happen? It's because they've lived 35 years under religious rule. They now know what they don't want. These are processes that have to work themselves out, and when they finally do, they produce results that come from people themselves and are not imposed from the outside, and those are the kind of results that are sustainable.
Right, and so to John's question, if this all sounds wimpy, ask yourself, the alternative is to have the 82nd Airborne or the Marine Corps or pick your branch of the service be responsible for reordering foreign societies, which are, after all, complicated. Now, this is not a knock on the military, my former colleagues in the military. This is not a knock on them. This is a point that these are very, very difficult problems. And Will did steal my line. Just because you have a hammer doesn't mean every problem is a nail. But understandably, we have this vast military capability. We can use it. We have used it. And so the next problem that comes along, we think, well, we can solve this problem like we solved Germany and Japan after World War II. Do you remember hearing that around the time of the Second Iraq War?
And it's amazing that it's a lot of conservatives who think this is a good idea.
Right.
And you know, most people who believe in limited government believe that there's a fundamental problem of government trying to order society, trying to fix problems that they don't have the proper knowledge, as Hayek talked about, to actually solve.
All right,
and yet they want to do this stuff in Iraq or Afghanistan. I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, remember government in a box in Helmand Province, Afghanistan?
Right.
I mean, if that doesn't oppose the kind of conservative understanding of the world, and Stephen has written a great piece for the Boston Globe basically calling this out, that conservatives should not be in favor of this kind of unlimited conflict with almost unlimited aims.
The title of this article was What a Truly Conservative Foreign Policy Looks Like. But you wouldn't have to reorder the society. History has shown, says John McCain, Having a strong presence abroad, just the presence, is the most reliable way to ensure our enemies do not expand and threaten us.
And what I believe he would say in the next breath is just look at Korea or look at post-World War II Japan, okay? We left a presence there, or Europe and Germany. We left a presence there, and that is the cause of peace in Europe and Asia.
And we have 30,000 soldiers in Japan and 30,000 in Korea still.
Right, a little bit more than that in Japan and about 30,000 in Korea. What's the difference, I ask you? The difference is these are very, very different countries. Germany, Japan, and South Korea are very different from Iraq or Syria or some of the other places that we're told, you know, Yemen, where we're fighting a war by proxy. Why are they different? Because they have these institutions that have been embraced by the people. They have a common identity, a national identity, which we don't see in the Middle East and has not existed for a very long time.
So the real point, I think, is it's not that either presence is good or the absence of presence. The imperative, I think, is to choose and to discriminate. When we were talking, several of us were talking before this event, I'm of the view that the U.S. military presence in Asia, even today, serves a useful purpose. Or to put it another way, if we pulled out of Japan and we pulled out of South Korea, the effect would probably be destabilizing, because the Japanese would almost inevitably embark upon a major arms race. The Chinese would view that as a threat to them. The Koreans would think they were caught in the middle. So in that particular case, there's a strong argument for U.S. military presence, at least at the present moment, serving a useful purpose. But if you look at the U.S. military presence in the Middle East, it seems to me that all of the evidence suggests that our efforts are not stabilizing. They are destabilizing. So it's not do everything or do nothing. It's being sufficiently pragmatic to be able to understand where U.S. military power can serve a useful purpose and act in those instances, but don't assume that U.S. military power is kind of a universal response to every problem on the face of the earth.
It's great for us to be present everywhere in the world where we're welcome, but that presence doesn't have to mean military occupation. There are so many other ways for us to be present. The most damaging ways that we're present are not just our military, the stationing of troops there, but it's our efforts to try to remake societies in the way that Andy mentioned. I want to give one example that I've studied quite a bit, and it has to do with Afghanistan. The first thing we decided after we got to Afghanistan was that this isn't a good country because there's no strong central government. Even when there was a king, the king wasn't really a king. He had to go around and ask local leaders for their permission. So we decided that's not a modern way to run a country. You have to have a centralized government with a capital and a president who has the last word and everything, and a parliament or a Congress, just like us. So we imposed that system in Afghanistan. Now, before we got there, for hundreds of years, this decentralized Afghanistan was run by local councils called shuras. Every region and every tribe and every group had a shura. There was one in each town, and there were one in larger regions. Now, how did you get to become a member of the shura, the decision-making body? You got to become a member because everybody in your town knew you, and they realized you were an honest, good person, and that's how you get on. If you're rich, if you're a drug dealer, if you have a lot of guns, if you're a warlord, that doesn't qualify you. You can't get onto the shura. Now we have a parliament. Who's in the parliament? Every drug dealer, every warlord, every criminal in Afghanistan, because they're the ones with the money to buy the seats. Amazingly, they've got a political system where the rich people can buy themselves seats in Congress. Sound familiar? So I would argue that by introducing some semblance of our form of government in Afghanistan, we actually made the country less democratic than it was under a system that we didn't like.
All right, but to give up now, another quote, and go home after all we've done is an insult to the sacrifice made by the soldiers who died fighting for us.
That is a recipe for permanent war forever.
Right.
There's always the argument, we can't go home now, we've been here too long.
Every place we've ever gone, we could never leave. And I think, again, I do think the memory of World War II, for the, partly for the reasons that Andy pointed out, is so damaging. Because we did leave troops in Germany, we did leave troops in Japan. After the Korean War, we left troops in Korea. But the question then is, when will anyone else in the world be responsible for their own security? Or do we just communicate to the entire world, we've got you covered. You have nothing to worry about. You go and do other things. You spend your money in other ways. That's what we said for a long time. I tell you all, it's unsustainable for a couple reasons. One, most importantly, because it isn't all that popular here in the United States. And if you're forced to choose between focusing on nation building here at home or nation building somewhere else, most Americans will choose nation building here at home.
But aren't we told that we should do both, that we have the infinite capacity to do both?
We're told that all the time.
But you don't have to go to a peacenik to get the answer to that. You go to the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, who said, our greatest national security threat is our debt and deficits. Because this is unsustainable, right? We're spending way too much on our foreign adventures, way too much on our military relative to what is necessary. Again, I'm not a pacifist. I think the United States needs to have a strong military, indeed the strongest military in the world, particularly in terms of its naval power and air power. But that doesn't mean we have to be spending what we are. And when you add that to what we're doing in domestic politics, it's a recipe for actually the decline of our power. So if you care about America being the #1 strongest country in the world, you have to have a strong economic foundation. And our policies are undermining and eroding that power. And it's a recipe for that typical rise or that typical fall you see of empires, that eventually they become sclerotic, they do more than they can achieve, and they fall. And there's all kinds of cultural reverberations of this as well that you could go into. War is a destructive and creative force, right? War is the health of the state, but it's a destroyer of other things, and it's a creator of things that are ultimately destructive. We should be very careful about this.
Let me make one quick point, because you may be under the impression that U.S. military spending has been dramatically cut over the last 8 or 10 years, or gutted is another word that I've heard thrown around.
And politicians do claim that.
It's false.
Yes.
U.S. military spending in inflation-adjusted terms is higher today than the average years during the Cold War. The 8 years under Barack Obama, ending in 2016, in inflation-adjusted dollars, will be higher in an average year than under George W. Bush. So the cost to maintain this presence is increasing. Even if we were just to maintain the presence, it would get more expensive. And if we were actually to spend what we needed to spend to maintain a primacy strategy, we'd need to be spending far, far more, because after all, if you notice, the rest of the world isn't cowed by our power the way they might have been once upon a time. And it's going to get harder. It's going to get more expensive.
And to send just one soldier to Afghanistan, the cost of that is what we could do to send 20 students to Phillips Exeter. So just imagine what we could do at even lower cost educational places.
They'd learn more in Afghanistan now.
Yeah.
Clearly, some wars are justified. I assume we all feel World War II was justified. Some of you were alive then, if you're in your 70s. In your lifetime, we have fought a bunch of wars. Can you even remember all of them? There was Korea, Vietnam, Bosnia, Grenada, the invasion, not all wars, military actions, Panama, Somalia, Haiti, Iraq War, first one, second one, Afghanistan, Libya, Panama. What are justified? If I can just run down the list, you agree World War II was worth fighting? They attacked us?
Yeah.
Any of these other actions?
I have a pretty simple set of criteria that I use to judge the wisdom or folly of a particular military enterprise. It's really just 4 things. The first is there a compelling U.S. national security interest at stake? Let's debate it. People can disagree, but let's at least debate it on those terms. Is there strong public support for the mission? I think that's important. 3, what is the mission? Can we describe it? Is there a militarily achievable mission? This is, after all, we're asking the military to do it. And the 4th thing is, it's rather banal, I'll admit, is that war is a last resort. Just because we have the ability to wage war really anywhere in the world at any time doesn't mean it's the first best option. These might sound familiar to you. Colin Powell and Cap Weinberger, not doves, either of them, were responsible for articulating a set of principles that are similar to that. And I think if you look at the list that you just listed, John, now some of those occurred during the course of the Cold War, which I think is a different context, but especially since the end of the Cold War, looking at a lot of these interventions, they did not advance U.S. national security interests. There was not strong public support for the mission. The mission was not clearly defined, and therefore, it wasn't justified.
And I'd like to add one other factor to that. I feel that we need, when we're selling the idea of a worthwhile intervention, to realize that any military intervention produces bad results. Now, there are cases when not intervening would produce an even worse result. Right. And in those cases, intervention is justified. But you should never sell a military intervention with the idea it's not going to have bad results. It always has bad results.
I think that's a good point. I mean, in other words, to push back a little bit, the notion of, make a list and either there are wars that were worth fighting or the wars that weren't worth fighting is too simplified. I mean,
yeah,
I would say, yeah. I mean, let us take the case of the Iraq War of 1990 to 1991. First of all, it didn't come out of the blue. We had supported Saddam Hussein during the prior war, the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988. In that sense, we were very much complicit in his outlawry, and it's important both from a moral and political view to acknowledge that. That said, I would argue that when he invaded and annexed Kuwait in August of 1990, a military intervention to turn that around, to turn that back, was entirely justified. George Herbert Walker Bush, in many respects, did a brilliant job of putting together a coalition, organizing the force, liberating Kuwait. But, and here we get to the complicator, the war that ended in February 1991 that we thought was a great and decisive and historic victory turned out to leave a host of loose ends and complications that ended up leading George Herbert Walker Bush and his successors to maintain a U.S. military presence in Saudi Arabia, thereby causing offense to this guy called Osama bin Laden, thereby leading bin Laden to declare war against us, setting in train a series of events that culminated in 9/11. That doesn't make us somehow guilty of having caused 9/11, but the point is that those who argue that even when war is justified, that the embrace of war is going to provide a neat and tidy, cost-free solution, have been proven wrong by history again and again and again. Hence the importance of recognizing that there will be bad things that will also result from intervention, even when there's an overall justification.
So let me add one thing also about Iraq, since Sandy mentioned it. I actually spent time in Iraq. I covered Iraq when Saddam Hussein was in power. And that was a real terror dictatorship. I mean, just any criticism of the government in public would lead to your immediate arrest and perhaps disappearance. And it's the harshest dictatorship I've ever been in. I've never really been in any situation like that before. However, there's one thing you could say about Iraq then that you can't say about Iraq now. In those days, everybody had to swallow their conscience. You had no free speech. You couldn't criticize the government. You had to say you loved Saddam. But if you agreed to do that, you could live a normal life. You could go to school. You could send your wife out to buy a bottle of milk at 9 o'clock at night. You could sit in a cafe. You were totally safe. Every other aspect of your life could go on as you wished. You could make a choice. You could follow your conscience and protest and take the consequences, or you could decide you wanted to live a normal life and abandon your right to free speech. Today in Iraq, no one has that option. There's no choice. There's no way you can say, what could I say? What could I believe that would allow me to live safely? It's now impossible for anyone to make that choice. We took it away from them by removing the stability that dictatorial regime provided.
And Steve, you teach at Brown. Isn't that the rule now? No free speech?
We're moving in that direction, I'm telling you. We could not show American Sniper because it was said to be possibly insulting to Muslims.
Right, yeah. Well, John, I would have a simpler criteria. I mean, I think that we really need to focus on, and I guess this is probably close to Chris, focus on what interventions would actually make us safer, with an emphasis on us. Because the US government, the US military, is designed to try to secure our rights, our territorial integrity, and so that should be the first thing it focuses on. And then if it does go abroad, it needs to think about what would the second order consequences be of our behavior. And I guess that touches on what Andy was saying, is what is going to happen? And some of those are unknown unknowns. But some of those are things that are eminently predictable. Those are things that you could imagine if you go into a place and decide to assert power there, that there's going to be pushback from local power brokers. And that could be potentially dangerous to your soldiers that are there with their government in a box.
All countries have vital interests, and all countries need to defend those vital interests. That's why it's so important to define your vital interests very narrowly. Don't have 100 of them. We have a vital interest to be sure that wars in other countries don't come to our homeland. We have a vital interest to assure that we're not attacked with weapons of mass destruction. We have a vital interest to maintain sea lanes that provide our commerce. I think I'm going to stop right there.
Right.
Let's not have any more than that.
Right, and crucially, other countries have vital interests too, and we should be moving in the direction that encourages those countries to deal with threats to their security before they become regional and global threats. The message that the US government has been sending for the last 60 or 70 years is exactly the opposite, that we will take care of all of these problems so that you don't have to.
That's what they call moral hazard.
Yeah.
On that note, let's open it up to comments and questions, and why don't you say who you are, or if you have
Now he's really in it. This isn't his,
doing his Oprah thing.
this
His
isn't
Oprah
his,
thing.
this
Betty
isn't his
Gay, a
element.
Republican from Salem, originally a Texan. What can we be doing, should we be doing, helping Jordan deal with the refugees? And you can talk about the other countries dealing with the refugees while you're at it.
Right, I think that, as I mentioned, the countries that are closest to Iraq and Syria and the refugee flows that are coming from Iraq and Syria are the ones that are under the greatest stress. So Jordan certainly, Turkey to a certain extent less, but they're a much larger country, so it's a little bit easier for them to accommodate even larger numbers of refugees. There are things the United States can do in terms of financial assistance and organizing for refugee camps and things like that. There are also international bodies that we are party to and support. I have no objection to that. But I also believe that this country, the United States of America, has been made better by people who are trying to flee oppression and to come here and to build a better life for themselves. So I believe that we should be part of that process that allows people to build a new life here or elsewhere where they want to go.
What he means to say is admit a very substantial number of Syrian refugees to the United States of America.
Yes.
That's what he meant to say,
Yes.
and he was beating around the bush.
And Andy, you would take 200,000.
I think 200,000 is a nice number.
This is a question that I've asked of many presidential candidates, and regardless of what they respond, they don't really have enough information. So I would like to ask...
That usually never stops them, but give your name first so your neighbors get to know you.
Yeah, I'm Judy Elliott from Canterbury, New Hampshire. I'd like to ask you about nuclear weapons modernization, which is a huge project to spend, I think it's $1 trillion over 30 years. I don't care what the exact figure is, or if it's $1 trillion or if it's not, but a huge new investment in every leg of the triad. And I'm also especially interested in hearing what you have to say about the new warheads.
Well, first of all, I think that this is a real danger to the world, not like an ISIS danger. I think we really have in recent years moved a lot closer to a danger of real nuclear conflict. And part of it has to do with the United States. It also has to do with the proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world. And there's still an intense desire in Washington to strengthen this option. We're not thinking about how we can reduce it. We have 7,000 nuclear missiles, enough to destroy the world many times over. But you know, where I work at Brown, we have a partnership with the Naval War College, which is right down the street at Newport. And I'm telling you, those naval officers are in a practically orgasmic state about China. They're loving it. This is their chance to go back and show the world what the Navy can do. They have a $100 billion project now, this Ohio replacement program, to replace our entire nuclear submarine fleet. And when I've talked to people at the senior people at the Naval War College, what are you thinking, $100 billion for this project? Their answer is, let me tell you, when we go to Washington and present it, you know what we get from the congressmen and senators? Why aren't you doing more?
It's a great question. It doesn't surprise me that they don't know the answer to the question. Trump didn't even know what the triad was. So credit to you. We wrote a paper about this at Cato a couple years ago. I'm very proud of it. We made the point that even if you believe in a nuclear deterrent of some sort, as a principle, that nuclear deterrent does not require very, very large numbers of warheads. Most countries that have chosen to develop nuclear weapons for a deterrent have not chosen to develop thousands of warheads, and you don't need a triad. As a historian, looking back on it, it's not clear to me that we ever needed a triad, actually. It sort of grew up through bureaucratic competition and a race for dollars.
I'm sorry to be dumb. What's a triad?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah,
Oh,
see,
Mr.
he's Trump. Okay, Trump is listening. Trump is listening.
That's Fox News.
He's going to learn this. Okay, so we have
huge.
Right, we have 3 different ways to deliver nuclear weapons. We deliver them by bombers. That's the first way that was developed. We deliver them by land-based missiles, ICBMs, and we deliver them by submarine-launched missiles, okay? And we have had this in existence since the late 1950s, okay? To Stephen's point, and this is how you should kind of rephrase it, hopefully, to get them to answer this question. Do you believe that it is so important to invest in modernizing all 3 legs that you would do so at the expense of surface ships, more troops, other aircraft that don't carry bombers, carry weapons?
So he's beating around the bush again. So the answer to your question, you just go on and on. The answer to your question is that we should move to a minimalist nuclear posture which would suffice to deter a nuclear attack against the United States, recognizing that nuclear weapons have no use other than that.
But that's an important...
Yes.
And we should recognize that with the advances in precision conventional munitions, if we need to destroy something or we need to kill something, the means are available to do this without resort to nuclear weapons. That's what he meant to say.
Andy knows our paper better than I do, so, you know.
Thank you.
I sleep better at night knowing we have a nuclear deterrent, and I'm very happy that we have the Ohio-class submarines, because I think deterrence, especially if you're someone who thinks we should do less in the world, deterrence is critical to make sure that we can assure that.
Thank you, John. Panelists, my name is John Sobrowski, former New Hampshire State representative from Bedford. I've heard a lot of comments about the Middle East and about traditional military. I'm a Marine Corps veteran, so I understand all that. Heard a lot of comments about hardware, but to me, I haven't heard a single thing yet about cybersecurity, which strikes me as a monstrous threat, not only today, but something that's going to really accelerate exponentially in the future. And I think we'd all love to hear your comments in that regard. Thank you very much.
I was really surprised that the biggest surprise to me about Obama's State of the Union address was that there wasn't a peep on this subject. So I think we've got, it's a big subject, particularly because of the privacy versus security balance that we have to strike, but it was remarkable to me that in listing all the challenges facing the United States, the president never even mentioned this one.
I think part of the reason may be that there are clearly government responsibilities to secure government assets, okay? And that's to defend against cyber attack by other states or even non-state actors against the federal government. But we all have responsibilities to defend our own computers. We download things like McAfee and Norton to protect our computers. So it's not a purely government response or a government problem, right? Cybersecurity is a bigger problem in a way that we don't treat traditional war, and that's why, I think.
Well, I'm not an expert on these matters, but the answers you're hearing, I agree with, and that is that the place to begin is to erect effective defenses, recognizing that because capabilities are changing so rapidly, you're never going to be able to say, well, we got it figured out. There'll be a continuing need to reinforce those defenses.
And I
what
take that-
troubles me is we've already opened the barn door to legitimating the offensive use of cyber weapons with the release of the Stuxnet, apparently in collaboration with Israel, to attack the Iranian nuclear program. And that bothers me because just as we set a precedent when we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we're setting a precedent with regard to the use of offensive cyber warfare that I fear will come back and bite us in the butt. I think that the imperative, and it's tremendously difficult, is to negotiate an international regime that will curtail the use of cyber warfare for offensive purposes.
Yes, thank you. I'm State Representative David Murataki. I represent Nashua's 5th Ward. I'm an Army vet, last served under Ronald Reagan as my final commander-in-chief. And I was a combat engineer, nuclear weapons officer, and finally an intelligence officer. So I've got this question for you. A lot of us realize that there's a pretty strong need to do what we call the China pivot. But that's going to take quite a few resources, both financially and in terms of manpower and weapon system platforms. So we also recognize that around maybe spring of 2017 or something, the Chinese are about to launch something big. They're getting ready for it now. So how do we, as a nation,
what are they about to launch?
A carrier, the aircraft carrier.
Carrier.
They've been building things like, the carriers, they've been building islands, they've been deploying all kinds of new weapon systems. They went ahead and essentially stole the plans for the Joint Strike Fighter, and they will be deploying and launching aircraft like that have a very similar deployment period. I believe we're planning on doing our own F-35 B and C deployments in that area in about March of 2017.
So let me take this one. So I think China is one of those states that could be a threat to the United States in the future, and so it's certainly something we should keep our eye on. But I would say this. It's not right around the corner like you hear in some places. It's not as if the Chinese are going to somehow be able to solve the issues of technology and geographic distance in a way that will threaten America's shores, right? I mean, there is still the notion that there is what's called the stopping power of water. If the Chinese would have a hard time invading Taiwan, which is undoubtedly a really big problem that they can't really handle, how are they going to get to California or Alaska, right? So do they really threaten our safety? Second question, do they threaten freedom of the seas? Well, they benefit from freedom of the seas right now economically. So why would they want to threaten that? And remember, the United States has, even if you only count the big aircraft carriers, we're committed to maintaining 11 carrier battle groups. And that doesn't even count the amphibs, right? So what that means is that we have 11, they have one that has a ski ramp, right? It's not exactly, they haven't exactly, figured out how to do advanced carrier operations. And
also, these islands they're building, the president says global warming's our biggest problem. Aren't they all going to be underwater?
yeah.
I'm told we have time for one last question. So.
Bottom line, don't get too spun up about it, I guess that's
Ever since the Soviet Union had the bad manners to disappear, we've been suffering from enemy deprivation syndrome. We're looking around the world, China, Russia. We're so eager to find someone to confront.
Don't forget the rogue state doctrine, right?
Get one more question.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I guess you could say I'm a libertarian. I have a bluish tinge. We do exist, I swear. My question is in an economic vein. So you say, some of you are talking about a changing role that the U.S. will anticipate in the next 50 or some odd years, both economically and militarily. I'm wondering, can you talk more specifically about what that might look like? Bonus points if you can talk about the Chinese Depression.
Well, I mean, when the Cold War ended, 1989, 1990, the excitement produced by that success produced a certain amount of speculation that history had ended, and that it had ended with the United States enjoying primacy, that there was only one superpower left. And that was folly then, and events have demonstrated the folly. It seems to me quite likely, not that I'm able to predict 50 years in the future, quite likely that as the 21st century evolves, it will evolve to create some sort of a multipolar order, that there will be some number of nation states that will, whose interests will have to be taken into account. Who? The United States, Japan, China, Russia to some degree, the EU in a weird way, perhaps Brazil, perhaps Turkey. Not all equal states. None of them, however, will we be able to ignore. And so the big question, it seems to me, of the 21st century is, will this multilateral order be more or less kind of sort of a peaceful one? Or will it be one that will produce substantial interstate conflict? And making it sort of kind of peaceful is, I think, the preeminent challenge facing American statecraft.
I take that just to give one little subset of that. One of my favorite writers, George Orwell, had the theory that in the future there would be three big powers. There'd be one major one and then two second-rate ones, and then one of those two second-rate ones would get stronger and stronger and become the number one. Then the number one would come down and merge with the number three, and you'd have a kind of a shifting group of three. Maybe it's not going to be three, but I think that's another predecessor idea to what Andy just told you.
You know, I'm pretty bullish on the American future because I believe that relative power is what matters. So I think that we have a lot of challenges in the future, but I think we have other states in the world that have even greater ones. So, for example, the issue you mentioned about the Chinese Depression. China has issues that are going to make it difficult for it to challenge us in terms of being the world's preeminent military power and even the world's preeminent economic power, particularly when we think about not just the overall size of the economy, but their per capita wealth. So a lot of countries have bigger problems than we do. We have problems on the horizon, but we also have mechanisms to change or to deal with some of those problems. You know, we're not going to just sit here and take this coming fiscal avalanche laying down. There are certain challenges to making sure we can confront those, but I think we have the mechanisms to that. And part of that is that we still have relatively good institutions. The rule of law still matters in America. There is still the capacity, because of representative democracy, to change who's in power. There are lots of issues in making sure that we don't get political cycling and other things that happen that don't allow for the proper types of change. But we do have a lot of capacity to just remember back to the 1970s, an era of malaise, right? Remember Jimmy Carter with his sweaters talking about our decline? And then we had this era of Reaganism, and we win the Cold War. So we have a great capacity for being flexible and changing and shifting and rising. And I think freedom plays a big part of that, and other states lack that.
Don't you think you're a little optimistic about the ability of our political institutions? It's very distressing to me to see what has happened to American politics in the relatively short space of my lifetime. The level of democracy in America has clearly declined. The ability of ordinary people to affect the shape and the direction of this country has declined. And to me, that's more troubling than any foreign threat.
Was it Churchill said that he counted on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else?
I hope we get there.
Right.
Yeah.
I was looking at John to call it quits.
That's
We're over
for
time.
Will to do.
Sure. Well, again, on behalf of the Charles Koch Institute, I want to thank you for coming out and to thank the panelists for hopefully what was a stimulating discussion. I'm just very excited. Maybe I'm part of the reason I'm bullish is because I saw a lot of people come out on a cold night to talk about important challenges our country faces, and just like last night. And that makes me happy and excited about what the future holds for our conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.